I stand before what was once a human being. Terror grips me. My whole body trembles, but I can still think, which means fear hasn't completely taken over my mind. After all, I may not be a doctor or a forensic expert, but I am a biologist, and the sight of a dead human body, even one so grotesquely mutilated, shouldn't fill me with fear and disgust. It shouldn't, but it does. All right, I need to pull myself together and try to understand what I'm looking at. He introduced himself simply as Uncle Fred. I never learned his full name. I don't know his exact age, but he seemed to be a little over 70. He was one of the last two remaining residents of Ohanka, a village near the university's biological station. The other inhabitant, if she's even still alive, is an incredibly obese old woman whose name I never learned. I only saw her a couple of times. For all I know, she might have died long ago and is still lying there in her hut, but I have no intention of finding out. The sight of Uncle Fred's dead body is more than enough to haunt me for the rest of my life. Uncle Fred lies just a few steps from his own porch, collapsed on his right side. His body is twisted as if some immense force had snapped his spine at the lower back. His head is thrown back, his mouth hangs open, and where his eyes should be, there are only black, empty sockets, most likely the work of crows. His clothes are torn, but it's his body that truly defies explanation. Both his chest and abdomen are riddled with holes, 5 in total. 2 of them, nearly 4 inches in diameter, lead into his abdominal cavity. The other 3, slightly smaller, pierce through his rib cage. The edges of the wounds are crusted with dried blood, yet they are eerily smooth, as if they had been carved out with some precise tool. And if you look closer, you realize something even more horrifying. There's nothing inside. No organs, no muscles, just a hollow skeleton wrapped in skin. Uncle Fred isn't just dead, he's been emptied. The forest is full of creatures that wouldn't turn down fresh human flesh. But I know of no animal capable of drilling such perfect holes and consuming only the insides. My mind races, struggling to piece together what happened. It seems like someone, or something, attacked the old man right by his own porch, snapped his spine, threw him to the ground, then tore open his clothes, punctured his skin, and hollowed him out, devouring everything soft inside. As I lay out the sequence of events in my head, terror fully consumes me. I want to scream, to let out the fear clawing at my throat, but what if it is still nearby? What if it hears me? That thought seizes my vocal cords like a vice. I glance around, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. Is it lurking just beyond my sight, waiting? But there's nothing. Just the abandoned houses staring at me with their hollow, shattered windows. Just the rustling forest. Just the September sun slowly sinking behind the treetops. Twilight will fall soon, and that thought jolts me back to reality. I need to cover the body, get back to the biological station, and contact the outside world as soon as possible. Well, as soon as possible is a bit of a stretch. There's no cell service out here. To get a signal, I'd have to hike nearly 3 miles upriver and climb to the top of a cliff known as Fisherman's Rock. There's no way I'm doing that in the dark, which means I'll have to wait until sunrise. First things first, covering up what's left of Uncle Fred. I can't just leave him out here for the animals to scavenge. Then again, after whatever did this to him, it's hard to imagine anything else desecrating the body any further. I cautiously push open the door to his cabin, flinching at the creak. My entire body is tensed, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. But inside, everything is silent. The air is thick with the musty scent of an old man's home. I grab the first blanket I see, filthy, tattered, full of holes, step back outside and drape it over the body. Then I stack some firewood around the edges to keep it in place. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. Now I can leave. A sudden wave of nausea washes over me. My legs buckle. Black spots dance before my eyes and my stomach twists, threatening to empty itself right then and there. Looks like the fear and stress are finally catching up to me. I stumble to the porch and collapse onto the weathered wooden steps, forcing myself to take slow, steady breaths. I have to pull myself together. I cannot let the fear win. It's not easy. My eyes keep darting back and forth, scanning every shadow, every movement. I have no idea what killed Uncle Fred, And the last thing I want is for it to suddenly appear right beside me. To be honest, even without the gruesome death, this village would still be terrifying. Abandoned houses always have an unsettling presence, like unburied corpses left to rot in the open. And here, there's an entire village of them, dozens of charred, crumbling cabins with gaping, empty windows staring like dead eyes. No, we have to leave. Hurry, hurry, run through the forest to the other side of the hill to the biological station. I push myself up from the wooden steps and start walking briskly down the trail, resisting the urge to look back. Just make it before dark. I keep moving, focused on each step, until I reach the very edge of the village. And then it happens. Like an icicle being driven into the back of my skull, a paralyzing chill shoots through me, freezing me in place. I hear something. I stop dead in my tracks, straining to listen, barely daring to breathe. The sound comes from behind me. Deep, muffled sobbing. The raw, broken cries of a woman drowning in grief. I fight the urge to turn around, but my mind betrays me, dragging up memories I don't want to recall. The last conversation I had with Uncle Fred. Every single word, every tiny detail, and suddenly I remember. As usual, we were drinking diluted alcohol from my scientific supplies. I poured myself just a small amount, barely more than a sip, mostly pretending to drink. But Uncle Fred, he had his fair share that night. Still, when I made some passing remark about how villages like this were dying out, he gave me a long, unexpectedly sober look and said, "Want to know why there's no one left here? Why it's just me and her?" With these words, he pointed his finger at the fat old woman's house. I nodded. And so, Uncle Fred told me a strange story, one that had happened long ago, nearly 20 years back. Back when he was still a passionate fisherman, never missing a chance to sit in his boat with a rod in hand. One July evening, he tied his boat to the willows above his favorite fishing hole, settled in at the stern, and set up his gear. But since the fish weren't biting, he eventually dozed off. I woke up, Uncle Fred said, because something was splashing right next to the boat, making it rock ever so slightly. I thought, what the hell is that? But by then it was dark. Couldn't see a damn thing. Lucky for me, I always carried a flashlight, one of those miner's lamps. Switched it on, shined it over the water. And you won't believe this, a kid, right there, floating beside the boat, staring up at me. A little boy, no older than 7. I said, "Are you out of your damn mind swimming at this hour? Get in the boat." I leaned over, reached out my hand to grab him, and that's when it got me. I remember how Uncle Fred paused then, asked for another drink, but didn't take a sip before continuing. Believe it or not, but instead of hands, it had tentacles, just like an octopus. Wrapped itself around my arm all the way up to my shoulder, latched on tight, and started pulling me in. I was scared out of my mind, yelling my head off, cursing one second, praying the next. Somehow I managed to tear my arm free, grabbed the oar, and started swinging like a madman. Don't know if I hit it or not, but I felt something. Wasn't just water I was smacking. And then, the damn thing disappeared. I untied the boat and rowed back to the village like a bat out of hell. Don't even remember how I made it. From that night on, I never went near the water again. Sold my boat, gave up fishing for good, and that's the end of it. Now let's drink. He downed his shot of alcohol while I just sat there, trying to decide what to make of his story. It was a classic folktale, plain as day, but I didn't want to insult an old man by dismissing it outright. Then he added, "After that night, I started hearing crying. Every damn night, like someone mourning a dead man." I asked him what that had to do with the village. "Everything," Uncle Fred said, "because after that, the village started dying too. The logging company shut down. The young folks packed up and left. Only the old ones stayed behind, and they started getting sick and dying off one by one." "What about you?" I asked. "Why didn't you leave? You weren't that old back then." He hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, see, that's the thing. After that night, I started drinking. A lot. Started hitting my wife. Sometimes my son too. And one day they just left, moved to the city and never looked back. I tried finding them, but what was the point? I only drank more. Got into trouble at work. Ah, to hell with it. He waved a hand dismissively and fell silent again. I didn't say anything either, just waited for him to go on. And after a minute, he did. That's when I learned that right around the time Uncle Fred's life took a turn for the worse, a new presence appeared in the village. Her, the old woman, the grotesquely fat one who lived next door. Believe me, Uncle Fred said, she was already an old woman back then. Maybe not as fat as she is now, but definitely old. No idea where she came from, but they gave her an empty house and the logging company even helped fix it up. And just like that, she settled in. Then someone started a rumor that she was gifted, one of those who can cast spells and lift curses. So I went to her, thinking, maybe, just maybe, she could help me. I barely started talking when she cut me off and said, I already know everything about you. You bear a heavy sin. You wronged the water mistress. You killed her child. And now she is taking her revenge on you. And the way she said it, Uncle Fred shuddered, like I'd murdered a human child, not some river filth I swatted with an oar. She told me my fate was sealed, that I was destined to outlive everyone in this village, everyone except her. I alone will witness your death, she said, and it will be a horrible one. Yeah, she said it just like that. And wouldn't you know it, 35 years have passed, and I'm the last one left in this godforsaken place. Another pause. Uncle Fred took another drink, then chuckled dryly. Though the old hag got one thing wrong, I'm still alive, and I haven't seen her in ages. Guess she kicked the bucket herself a long time ago. That was the conversation we had. Of course, I didn't believe a single word of his story, not one bit. Any folklore enthusiast has heard dozens just like it, always told in the first person or from the perspective of a close acquaintance. And honestly, blaming your own mistakes on some kind of water spirit? That's just ridiculous. Uncle Fred had ruined his life all on his own. No curses, no vengeful river witches, just alcohol and bad choices. Still, I nodded along, listened politely, and memorized the tale. Figured it would make for a good story to share with friends later. Then I said goodnight and headed back to the biological station, promising the old man I'd stop by again in 3 days. So I visited, and now I stand here, hearing someone's muffled sobs. I really want to turn around, but at the same time I am afraid to do so, convinced that I will see something so terrifying that I will no longer belong to myself. I am torn by contradictions like Lot's unfortunate wife. I clench my fists, gather my will, and turn around, ready to face a ghost or a banshee. But there is no one behind me. Instead, I immediately determine the source of the sound. It's coming from the house of the fat old woman, the witch. The sobbing or moaning is coming from behind the locked door. I try to think. So the old woman hasn't disappeared? Has she been sitting in her house all these days, old and weak, slowly dying of hunger and loneliness? I understand that now I simply cannot continue on my way and spend the rest of my life convincing my conscience that I have nothing to do with this. I will try to help as much as I can, and tomorrow, right at dawn, I will climb to the top of Fisherman's Rock and call for help. Besides, maybe the old woman knows what killed Uncle Fred. I step onto the rotten porch steps. I'm afraid they might collapse under me. Carefully, I knock on the door and listen. Silence. I knock again and pull the door toward me. It's not locked. Taking a deep breath, trying to calm my heart as it pounds against my ribs, I take a determined step into the darkness of the house. Agonizing seconds pass as I wait for my eyes to adjust, but there's nothing to see. The entryway is completely empty. That's not right. I've been inside village houses before. I know that the entryway usually looks like a small storage room, cluttered with tools, firewood, or sacks of something. But here, nothing. Fine. It's none of my business. I'm here for another reason, and yet I can't help but notice how quiet it is inside. At some point, the moaning or sobbing stopped, and I hadn't even noticed when. That's a bad sign. Did the old woman die just moments before I arrived? I knock on the door. "Grandma," I call out. "Are you okay? Are you in there?" I freeze and listen. As if in response, a strange clucking sound comes from inside the house. The unexpected noise makes me flinch, At least she's alive. But can I actually help her? I pull the door open with determination and step inside. Grandma, I say again, are you feeling unwell? Do you need help? It's a little brighter inside the main room than in the entryway. Faint traces of the September evening seep through tiny windows covered in unbelievably filthy glass. Glass that, at just a glance, I notice looks like it was deliberately coated in dust and draped in layers of cobwebs. The house is empty. Not just empty, completely empty. No furniture, no belongings. The stove, nothing more than a pile of crumbling bricks, reminds me of a decayed corpse. And in the middle of this emptiness, this ruin, this filth, sits the old woman. She sits directly on the floor. She is fat. She is monstrously fat. Absolutely enormous. I have never in my life seen a person this fat. It must weigh at least 800 pounds and perhaps even half a ton. She is wrapped in layers of rags, likely old blankets, and her body shakes violently with sobs. Hello, I say, then ask again, are you unwell? The old woman doesn't answer. She doesn't react at all to my presence. Deaf, blind, insane, or all three at once? I don't know. Poor woman. I step closer, once again struck by just how fat she is. Her small head, absurdly tiny in comparison to her massive body, is bowed low, trembling with silent sobs. I want to comfort her. Gently, I reach out and touch her shoulder. She lifts her head. I freeze. My breath catches in my throat. Her eyes, bulging, unblinking, completely lidless, stare straight at me. They are not human eyes. They are fish eyes. Even in the dim light, her skin is deathly pale, hanging in loose, sickly folds. She has no nose, just the faintest hint of a bump, like a syphilitic deformity, and below it, a massive, grinning, completely toothless mouth. Before me is not a feeble old woman. Before me is not a person at all, and it is not sobbing. It is bursting into laughter. I stumble backward, tripping over something, a fallen brick from the ruined stove, I think, and crash onto my back, barely managing to catch myself with my hands. Now I'm crawling, dragging myself backward like a spider, hands and feet scrabbling against the floor until I hit the corner. There's nowhere left to go. I curl into myself, unable to tear my eyes away from the creature sitting across from me. And as I watch, the old woman begins to change. It rises from the floor, shedding the decayed blankets wrapped around its form. I see now that what I thought were arms, pressed tightly against its chest, were nothing but a crude imitation, made from the same rotting fabric. It never had arms. It never had anything remotely human. The last piece of cloth falls away, and I see it looms over me, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. It looks like a towering octopus with a human head. What I had mistaken for the bloated body of a fat old woman was, in reality, a writhing mass of thick, pulsating tentacles. One of them sways directly in front of my face. Its slick, rounded tip slowly unfurls like a blooming flower, revealing a gaping, circular maw lined with rows of tiny, needle-like teeth, just like a lamprey's. I understand now what kind of death Uncle Fred suffered. I stare at the gaping, gluttonous tentacle, waiting for it to strike. For some reason, I know it will lunge forward like a striking snake, piercing my chest and hollowing me out from the inside. Death is right here, impossibly close. A death too horrifying to comprehend. And yet, I feel no fear, no sorrow. I simply wait. Time drags thick and heavy. And then I see the petals close again. The maw seals shut. The tentacle withdraws from my face, pulling back toward the creature's body. And then I hear it. A voice, deep, guttural, more like a bubbling croak than human speech. It is done. The words spill from the creature's grotesque, toad-like mouth. It turns away from me, making it clear I am no longer needed, no longer of interest. Its writhing mass of tentacles moves with newfound purpose, its body gliding across the floor, slithering toward the door. With a sickening, wet squelch, it squeezes itself through the entrance and disappears. I am alone. Utterly, completely alone. Time loses meaning. I come to my senses only when the world around me has been swallowed by the darkness of night. Slowly I stand. On unsteady legs, I step onto the porch. Above me, the sky stretches vast and indifferent, scattered with stars and a bright August moon. Ahead, the forest stands as a looming black wall. Behind me, the empty husk of a dead village. Now, it is truly dead, because even the undead have abandoned it. I think about how every story only becomes a story if there is someone left to witness and tell it. I know I will tell this one. I know no one will believe me. I take a deep breath of the cold autumn air, step down onto the earth, and begin walking, slowly, steadily, toward the forest. Through it lies the path back to the biological station. For some reason, I am not afraid.